Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. Thank you. When I rose this morning at about 5 o'clock, I had some messages from Europe, my usual overnight briefing. And I was reminded that today is a turning point in world history. First of all, 140 years ago, the fate of the United States was being decided on the battlefield of Gettysburg on the same date. Today, or this week, starting Monday, there's a change in the policies of Europe, which will be a change in world policy. And whether they know it in Washington, it will be a confrontation with the government in Washington now. The assumption of the position of leader for the coming 6 months of the European Union by the Prime Minister of Italy, Berlusconi, and his address, which he delivered yesterday, defines a change in the world economic and financial situation, a policy change. As a result of efforts which I've been involved in Italy and elsewhere, including votes taken by a majority of the Chamber of Deputies of Italy, resolutions coming out of the Senate of Italy, and other things in other parts of the world, and with the initiative of the extraordinary finance minister, economics minister of Italy, Tremonti, it was presented to the European Union yesterday by the Prime Minister of Italy a proposal for the implementation of a large-scale infrastructure program for Europe as a recovery program based on what is called the European Investment Bank. This European Investment Bank will do what many people in many states of the United States wish would happen under the present economic conditions. And that is large-scale infrastructure programs in necessary infrastructure, as in transportation, power, and so forth, water management, in order to stimulate employment on long-term projects financed through the European Investment Bank, which will be outside the control, the monetarist control of the European present Maastricht agreements, the so-called Stability Pact agreements. Now, there'll be a fight about that. Delors, a former minister of France, spoke on this. Others spoke on this. This is going. Not only is this happening, but at the same time, in Asia, especially as a result of a recent visit by the Prime Minister of India to China on an official state visit, there will be an acceleration in infrastructure building programs throughout Eurasia. That is, large-scale programs in China are already underway. New programs are being negotiated, major projects, India and China. Southeast Asia, the Mekong Development Project is a major project underway. There are large-scale projects which will involve Europe as well as Asia, and this means that Asia is committed to a program of recovery which is not entirely unlike what Franklin Roosevelt did from 1933 on, from his inauguration as president. That is happening in Europe. It is not adequate, of course, but it shows a sign of the times. Similarly, in the United States, despite the government in Washington, despite a lunatic Alan Greenspan, throughout this country, the states of the United States know they're bankrupt. 46 at least of the 50 states are in a virtual state of bankrupt. They cannot raise the taxes to balance their budgets. And if they don't, something is going to collapse inside the state economy. Some states are moving with small-scale infrastructure proposals in that direction, but there is no federal support for it. So therefore, under these conditions, and with the imminent total collapse of the present world monetary financial system, to which I'll refer a little bit later, this means we're at a turning point in world history. comparable to the crisis periods of the 1930s, but much more severe. Now, what I shall address today are several points which are interrelated. First of all, I wish to make clear the similarities and differences between the problems faced by the United States with the inauguration of President Franklin Roosevelt and during the 1930s and today. That we then, as now, the world is dominated by the imminent general collapse of the existing world financial system. Then it was the Versailles financial system which was collapsing. Today, it is the floating exchange rate monetary system established between 1971 and 1972. Nothing can prevent these systems in their present form from collapsing. The collapse is more or less immediate. And what Alan Greenspan is doing is actually criminal. That is what Alan Greenspan is doing right now. He's got a hyperinflationary drop of the discount rate. This hyperinflation is a trap to lure suckers into financial markets for one last go. Soon, one of these bubbles or more of the bubbles will blow out. Credit derivatives bubbles, mortgage-based securities bubbles, similar kinds of bubbles will blow. At that point, the present plan is to run the interest discount rate up to, say, 6, 7, or 10%, which means that all of those suckers who have expressed their confidence in the present financial market will be looted. We will have businesses collapse, state governments collapse, everything collapse if Alan Greenspan and his crowd have their way. I know what they're up to. So therefore, this is the kind of situation we face. We also, of course, as you know, are involved in wars. How does this come about? Compare the two periods. Compare what Roosevelt faced and what we face today. Then, we had a crisis, a threat of fascism in Europe, not just in Germany, Italy, France, Spain, and also in the United Kingdom. There was a conspiracy by a group called the Synarchists, which is a front group for a group of bankers, to establish a fascist dictatorship, a so-called Synarchist dictatorship, involving France, Italy, Germany, Spain, and also the United Kingdom. At that time, to prevent this from being consolidated, President Franklin Roosevelt had discussions with Churchill, Winston Churchill, who later became Prime Minister, was becoming Prime Minister in this period, to try to prevent those inside the United Kingdom who intended to cooperate with Hitler, with fascists in France, with the Franco regime, with the Mussolini regime, and with the Hitler regime, especially with Goering, to establish a coalition which would take over Eurasia and, with the cooperation of the British Navy, challenge the United States and conquer it. Under those conditions, there developed a cooperation among two gentlemen who didn't like each other at all, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. But they recognized they had to have a coalition of forces to prevent this catastrophe from occurring. Churchill had communicated to Roosevelt his intention and commitment to take the British Navy to Canada if England were overrun. It didn't happen. But Roosevelt treated the commitment as serious, and the United States policy was oriented in that direction. We stopped it. Then, but in a later period, we had a similar situation. We had, in the recent period, we've had something like the Versailles system or worse, the floating exchange rate monetary system, which is now disintegrating. This system has inspired some people, like the fascists, the Synarchists of the late 1920s and 1930s, who launched the Hitler effort, to launch a similar effort inside the United States. The effort is centered on those we call the neoconservatives. Not only the neoconservatives inside the Republican Party gathered around Dick Cheney, the vice president, but the neoconservatives also, who were their buddies inside the Democratic Leadership Council and those corresponding sections of the National Committee. The reason we went to a war in Iraq was because the Democratic Party was neutralized by the belief that Cheney had the evidence that Iraq was getting nuclear weapons. Cheney knew there were no such nuclear weapons. Cheney knew the story about Niger Yellowcake going to Iraq was a fraud. And yet, with that knowledge, he pushed that argument in order to convince the Congress to subside and to allow the war to go ahead. The Democratic members of the Senate who should have stopped the war did not do it. They consented to it. We're now in a war which is a mess, for which there is no solution. The President of the United States is talking about a long period of occupation, which we can ill afford. There's also the threat of a war against Iran spreading around the world because the Democratic leadership in the Congress did not have the honesty and guts to exercise their constitutional responsibility to prevent this war from occurring. And when they squawk about the war or squawk about the issues, they're committing a fraud. They didn't stop it when they could have. No one moved against Cheney on his fraud. They all talked about how bad the president was. You can't impeach this president. You can't convince him of intent. He's not smart enough to know what his intent is. You want to stop the war, get Cheney out. Any serious person knows that. And if Cheney goes, Rumsfeld will go, his so-called chicken hawks will go, and we will have a new opportunity to re-scramble and reconfigure our national policies. But the point is, this is fascism. What Cheney represents, or I think Cheney's a dummy, I think his wife's a ventriloquist, she's the one who's the smart one of the family. What Cheney represents is the same kind of threat that Adolf Hitler represented in 1933, 34, and beyond. If we don't stop it now, we'll find out what happened in Germany as our own experience now. And therefore, that's the issue on the table. The issue right now is not who is going to win the November 2004 elections, not who is going to be president in 2005. The issue is, are we going to get to that point without going to hell instead? We have to change the politics of the United States now on 2 points, as Roosevelt did then, in a much more serious situation now. We have to deal with the economic crisis, which is destroying our people and threatening the world. We have to deal with the war threat, which can take us down the road that took Germany under Hitler, or something worse. These are the 2 questions which we must deal with this year, not next year, not 10 months from now, not 5 months from now. Now. And therefore, we have to change the Democratic Party at the top by getting the present right-wing gang out of control of the Democratic Party. If we don't, and those candidates who will not do that ain't worth shucks. Let's take the case, for example. There's only one of these 9 who are my putative rivals who are worth mentioning, and that is Senator Kerry. The others are not necessarily bad people, but they do not represent a serious proposition of contention for the nomination for the presidency. Kerry does, in a sense. He has certain points in his favor. Unfortunately, so far, Senator Kerry has played the role of Hamlet. Now, let me just go through this issue of Hamlet because it's a typical problem in American politics. We have a lot of Hamlets in politics. I used to accuse Bill Clinton, who I liked, and I still do, of playing the part of Hamlet. Now, as we know, Senator Kerry has a rather distinguished war record. He's not a coward. Neither was Hamlet. Hamlet was a swordsman. When his father was being murdered, he was out slaughtering Poles. A swordsman, a professional soldier. He ran his sword through a curtain without even knowing who was standing behind it and killed poor Polonius. He was a warrior. But as he says in this third act soliloquy of his, after going through the threats to Denmark, his kingdom at that time, and saying, but thus, when we shuffle off this mortal coil, what becomes of us? What happens to us after death? This thought, he says, makes cowards of us all. It doesn't make coward of me, but it made a coward of Hamlet. And in a sense, it made a coward of Senator Kerry, who, when he had a chance to speak out and say, who is responsible for the fraud of the Iraq War, when he could have said Cheney, he didn't. He pointed to that poor president who cannot be convicted of intent, George Bush. And what do you want to do? Get rid of poor George Bush and get Cheney as president? Do you want to get the fool out in order to get the devil in? Not good politics. That's the kind of situation we faced. Economic situation similarly. We face an immediate crisis. Now, some people say Europe's a problem, Asia's a problem, those guys overseas, they're the problem. They're not the problem. They are a problem. I know them better than you do. I deal with them. I have been dealing with them. Many of them are my friends, or many of them I talk to. I spend a good deal of my time overseas, or dealing otherwise with leading circles in foreign countries. What any decent presidential candidate of the United States would do. Because the main business of the United States as a world power is to account for our dealings with foreign nations. To the south of our border, Africa, Eurasia, dealing with China, dealing with the Korea situation, dealing with Japan crisis, dealing with India, dealing with Russia, dealing with Western Europe. Where are our politicians on these questions? Nowhere. They're sitting here talking about how good they're going to be, saying nothing. Now, I've been dealing with that. Now, what's the situation? We have presently the most important and largest scale program of economic expansion ever dreamed of in human history, now beginning in Eurasia. China, for example, the largest water projects in history. The Mekong, Southeast Asia and China, the Mekong project, one of the largest water projects in history. China is launching one of the largest railroad building projects in history. India is now in discussion with China on one of the largest water projects in the world, the Brahmaputra Power Project, on the borders of Tibet and Assam. Europe knows that it's bankrupt unless it can export to Asia. The biggest export market for Germany is China. The next largest export market for Germany is India. The survival of Western European economies depends upon increasing their output largely through export and trade, and chiefly to Southeast Asia. Africa is subject to genocide. Without a recovery in the Americas and without a recovery in Eurasia, it will be impossible to reverse the genocide which is going on in Africa. These are the kinds of things that confront us, should confront a president. The problem today is that everyone is afraid to take on the IMF directly. In the case of the recent meetings which occurred in Europe this week, with Berlusconi addressing the European Parliament in his new position, the problem is, well, these fellows are willing to move on good projects. Like many states are willing to move ahead with proposing good projects of infrastructure building under present condition. I think about 7 of these states have significant projects they're now discussing. They're not willing to bite the bullet on the big question. The point is the present world monetary and financial system is hopelessly bankrupt. There's no way by small reforms within the present world financial monetary system that this world economy can continue to function. This world banking system is bankrupt. The leading banks of the United States are bankrupt. Now that means that the Federal Reserve System is bankrupt. We have a similar situation in the banks of Europe, with very few exceptions. They're bankrupt. Outside of China, pretty much the banking system of the world are bankrupt. That means the IMF is bankrupt. It means the World Bank is essentially bankrupt. And it's bankrupt because its policies have been bankrupt since 1971, 1972. Now, what do we do under these conditions? There's no way we can pay off the world's debts. There's no way we can reschedule the world debt and manage them. It can't happen. Much of this debt has to be wiped off the books. Without that, there's no recovery. What do? We do two things. First of all, we say that the fundamental obligation of government is the general welfare of its people, both the present generations and posterity. The fundamental responsibility of government is to accomplish this in a sovereign way, to use the sovereignty of government and the sovereign powers of government to protect and to promote the general welfare and the welfare of posterity. Therefore, when we're faced with a bankruptcy, for example, the local bank or the local firm is going bankrupt and that institution is essential to that community, we step in with the power of government and we put that institution into receivership for bankruptcy reorganization. We keep the institution functioning. We work out a program under which the institution will continue to function and recover from its diseases and problems. We will write off what we have to write off in terms of paper, but we will keep these institutions functioning for the benefit of the general welfare. We will intervene to take measures to increase employment, as Roosevelt did. And the only place that government can do an effective job in increasing employment is in basic economic infrastructure. Transportation, water projects, reforestation, power generation and distribution, things we need very much these days. These projects, as Roosevelt used these methods, will work and have worked in the past. That's what Europe's talking about. That's what many states are thinking about inside the United States today. So therefore, to bite the bullet means, with the IMF bankrupt, that the governments of the world, the sovereign nations of the world, which are the owners of the IMF politically, as sovereign powers, must put the IMF into bankruptcy reorganization. They must also prepare to put the banking system of the United States into bankruptcy reorganization. We cannot have chaos. We cannot have people dying because of a breakdown of the financial system. We must maintain order. And we must have a recovery program to meet the needs of present and future generations. Now, therefore, the big problem before the world is the fact that while many governments, including those of Europe today, groups of nations in Europe today, are willing to proceed on infrastructure projects which are viable and needed, they are unwilling so far to take on the big nut. And the big nut is who is going to reorganize a bankrupt international monetary financial system. That is where the United States, which has now been transformed from what it used to be, the greatest productive power on this planet, into a consumer society, which is a parasite, a predatory parasite upon the world and upon its own citizens. That's where the United States become crucial. Because of our history and because of the power we represent, a president of the United States calling leading nations of the world together now to put the IMF into bankruptcy reorganization for a general world effort at general recovery will work. That's where the United States is indispensable. And that is the kind of leadership the President of the United States must show. There are certain things in our position as a world power, we should use that power not to become an empire. We have no business becoming an empire. But the fact that we have great power, great influence, means we must use that power not merely for our own advantage, but for the defense of humanity. Because we can call nations together to make decisions they were otherwise unwilling or lack the courage to make. The same thing is true in Asia. Great projects are going on in Asia. But taking on the IMF system, putting it through bankruptcy reorganization, which is required, is what they're not prepared to do without the consent or backing of the United States. And we need a President of the United States who will do that. We need a candidate for President of the United States, a President in the wings, who will assure them that that is going to happen. Otherwise, we're not going to get through this mess. Now, let's go back a bit and say, who are these guys, these Synarchists? And it's literally an organization. Let me just tell you about it. I knew pretty much back over the 60s and 70s, I knew what this organization was. I knew it descriptively. But I didn't have some of the fine points and details. And as a byproduct of my work with the Reagan administration in pushing my project, which was known as SDI, certain papers were declassified and made available to me through the National Archive. I was told to get over to the National Archive and pick up these papers which were being declassified, which were there for my edification. And this was a collection of papers dating from the early 1920s until 1945 on a subject of investigations in the United States, U.S. military intelligence, during wartime OSS, and also French intelligence, French military intelligence and other branches of French intelligence. And this concerned a group which was listed under the category Synarchist, Nazi, Communist. This is the group which was behind the Hitler Project, behind the Mussolini Project, and so forth, the group which is assembled in that form in about 1920 at the end of World War I. This is the group. Now, this group has two levels. It has a political level of agents, and people like Cheney, the followers of Leo Strauss, the so-called neoconservatives in the United States today, whether in the Republican Party or in the leadership of the Democratic Party, the DLC, for example, are Synarchists of this category, U.S. official category, Synarchist, Nazi, Communist, dating from the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. They still exist. Behind the people, like the Cheneys and so forth, who are the tools of this group, are groups of bankers, financial interests, dating back from the 14th century Fondi of the famous Lombard bankers that caused the great crisis of that period. These small groups of people, faced with a financial crisis and with great power leverage from behind the scenes, will say that in a crisis of this type, such as the Versailles system collapse or the present collapse, that they know that governments pressed will tend under pressure of the people to take measures which are consistent with the general welfare of the people and the sovereignty of nations. Therefore, they say we have to prevent that. And the way to prevent that is to install a dictatorship which will control the situation under those kinds of financial conditions. That was the case in 1928 to 1933. That is the case today. Small groups of financial interests, and I know many of them by name, and they're in New York and elsewhere today, the same groups that were behind the Hitler campaign then, today. And these are the groups who the neocons represent. So the problem is the issue of this correlation between financial monetary crisis and war and fascism. or things like fascism. And every time we get into a crisis in the 20th century or now, these groups begin to move in that direction. The idea of setting up dictatorship and going to war as a way of controlling a situation to make sure that governments do not emerge which will make the reforms which might hurt the perceived interests of certain financier groups. And that's what we face today. So my job is rather simple at that point. I do know what to do. I do know who the enemy is. I do know what the general remedies are. I do have knowledge of what people in various parts of the world are thinking about this. I do know what the United States could successfully do in providing leadership, which is not coming otherwise from the political circles inside the United States. And therefore, my job is to act as if I were president. And that's happening. It's happening with the reception I've received, for example, recently in Turkey, or the reception I had throughout the Arab press, or my recent participation at a key conference in Bangalore, India, my meetings in various countries. These are the things I'm discussing with them, these kinds of options. I am prepared to be President of the United States today, except one problem. I need a government. Now, when I look at these candidates, and I look at other people, I'm looking in a very practical sense of, where's my government? Now, a government to me means several things. It means obviously the obvious institutions of government. We have those institutions. But I'm talking about a team. Remember when Roosevelt became president in 1933, he went in with a program called the New Deal, already so-called, and he went in with a team. And the first 30 days, not the first 90, or the first 100, but the first 30 days were crucial. It was what he did in those first 30 days determined the success of Roosevelt's administration. Now, the government of the United States, the new government of the United States, must be of that form. There must be a team. I have to have my team. And there's a second team I want to talk about too, the interim team. My team is picking things like vice presidents, key appointees who will be selected for the same way that Roosevelt selected his key figures. Each will have a mission. And as a group, they will be a mission-oriented group to solve the tasks. I'm also looking at people in government. I'm looking at people in the military, at other institutions, who I know are trustworthy and reliable, trying to find out who they are and select them as a team. On the day I walk into the White House, we'll go in with a team, prepared to take over the way Roosevelt did and solve the problems. Now there's a second team that's needed. I'm not president, unfortunately for this nation. What happens if we remove Cheney and the chicken hawks, the neoconservatives? Well, we'll have a new situation in the United States. Remember, the people who took over the government under George Bush after September 11th are a small group, relatively small, a few hundred people at most, with a hard core of a few score. This is a rump government, a dictatorship, a junta is running a government for a president who is not really a president, who operates on the basis of emotions which are not always pleasant, but the poor fellow does not really know what he's doing. He just knows he wants to be reelected. And, for example, we want this fellow who wants to be reelected to do a job about bringing about Middle East peace. We want Palestinian-Israeli peace now. We need it now. We don't want this thing running out of control. We want to do something about this mess which Cheney and Rumsfeld made in Iraq. This is a hopeless sinkhole. This is worse than Vietnam in terms of its potential. It's a desert Vietnam. And it's going to look more and more like that as the days pass. This was a piece of stupidity beyond belief. Now, but going back to government, who is opposed to this war? From what I can tell, most of the retired and serving flag officers of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, and some in the Navy and Air Force as well. Everybody of any competence, then and now, said this was a bummer. Under no conditions should the United States become involved in this war. They not only raised objections, they raised specific objections. For example, to take the case of Iraq. Now, suppose there were a legitimate reason to invade Iraq, which there was not. There was no need to do so. It was not legitimate. No reason for it. But suppose there were. What would this require? This would require 10 heavy divisions, or 10 corps plus, 10 corps. That is a couple of divisions, heavy divisions in each, with auxiliary troops, including medical, all the rest of the stuff. Because when you invade a territory, you are responsible the minute you occupy it to maintain it and deal with it. The objective is to come out with a success. Is to come out with a pacification, a successful pacification of the territory you've invaded and get out. The way we tried to in Europe. Move in and get out. That means you pre-assign a full corps to each corps area, which is not merely for the purpose of invasion, but it's for the purpose of occupation and getting out. You organize the institution which you find on the ground. You don't try to bust them up and start from scratch. You organize them immediately. Find all the local leaders, in each case, get things functioning immediately again. Get the fire system functioning, the water system, the food system functioning, the hospital system functioning. Get things functioning and get out. And our military leaders who criticized this spoke of this very clearly. They're still speaking about it. And the nonsense still goes on. You have one of my old enemies, an idiot, Bremer, in there as the czar of the country, making a worse mess of the thing day by day. One idiotic decision after the other. So therefore we have in our existing institutions, in this case the military institutions, not only those in uniform, but those who are working as civilians in that division, in the military services, who are competent and know how to do the job. That's what we have. We have people who are senior diplomats, retired or serving, who are competent in these kinds of things, who serve our government, who are loyal servants of government, who can be called back in to advise. They're there. So if we eliminate a few of these junta characters who are dominating the government today, send Cheney back to Wyoming to grow potatoes, find some place to dump Rumsfeld, get these fools out. We have in government, around this poor president, we have people in the executive branch or who are associated with the executive branch who represent all the intelligence and capability needed to do an honest job and keep things functioning with some kind of policy directive. If we can shape the Congress back into some kind of shape, especially get the Democratic Party into shape, we'll do fairly well. You've seen the group around Scowcroft, the old Bush crowd. They've been behaving themselves on this thing fairly well. You see people like John Dean and his crowd, they're behaving themselves fairly well. Not always doing the right thing, but they're sane. So we have Republicans as well as Democrats who are perfectly sane. And if we remove this junta factor and we realize what has happened to us, and if we hate what has happened to us and we try to get back to normal, during the next year and a half or so, we can get through in terms of day-to-day management. We can restore our relations with nations in Eurasia. We can restore our relations with nations in Central and South America. So that you have another team. You have a team of capabilities of people who are serving in government or who were associated with government who can step in and advise this poor president what he should do. And the poor dummy. I mean, I'm not trying to hurt the man. The man, he hurt himself already enough. He's born dumb. But he's the president. And we have to have the minimal crisis of our institutions. Therefore, this president preferably should sit there. But he should learn to do as he's told by people who are wiser than he is. And rely upon them on one message. You know how you handle a dumb president. You say, now look, dummy. President Dummy, Mr. Dummy. Our job is to make your presidency successful while you have it. If you behave yourself and listen to us, we guarantee you can go out of here clean. And nice retirement. And they'll be called Mr. President after that, even after you're out. That's the way you handle it. And that's what I propose to do with the poor dummy. Is to say, protect the guy. He's mean-spirited. He's difficult to deal with. May have to talk to his mother about him. What we're going to do with him. But this is the president. We have to protect our constitutional institutions. And the best way to do it, get these bums out and realize that we have a potential team already sitting there. People in government, in the executive branch, in specialist divisions, skilled people who have called into action around a theme, an idea, are capable of keeping this ship afloat. Under those circumstances, faced with an international financial crisis, and faced with the opportunities which are presented to the United States now, from Europe and from Asia in particular, with these opportunities, I'm sure that these fellows, without the burden of these neocons, and seeing the crisis we face, will tend to respond intelligently to our friends abroad. I have an idea what's happening in France. I'll find out more in the coming weeks and months. I know something of what's happening in Italy. I know what's happening in China and India. I know certain things about the Arab world, and I'm talking with leading diplomats and others around the world constantly. I've got a good smell of what the world would like from the United States. I know the deal, as they call it, we can cut. I know the crisis we face. We can get through this quite well, even under this president, if we know how to play it. We'll send him out of office in January 2005 saying, Mr. President, you are Mr. President. You'll always be Mr. President to us. Now go home and enjoy yourself. So in that sense, I have to be the acting president of the United States because we just don't have one handy at the time. We have a sitting president, and that's what he's best at. Probably when he's not lifting weights or whatever. But we don't have a candidate for president. Not on the Republican side, and so far not on the Democratic Party side. Now, certainly I would not deprecate Senator Kerry. I have a great deal of regard for him. I think his wife may be better than he is. She may be tougher. But that's fine. He's a fine fellow. We'll work with him for what he is. But we'll not expect from him what he's not. And he is not a president for these times of crisis. And the rest of them are poor losers compared to him. Now, many of them may be useful. They may have useful roles. I mean, Kucinich has an interesting, he'd never make president, but he has an interesting constituency which any political figure in the United States is going to pay attention to. Others of these candidates represent constituencies which any person in high office is going to pay attention to, is what you're going to work with. But none of them come close to being president, and none of them even come close to being a Kerry. So therefore, for this period of time, I have to act like an acting president. A couple days ago, this on past Sunday, I gave a presentation at a meeting in New York City, a few hundred people, which was videotaped and will be on the website soon. You can compare that with what I've said here so far today. It's a little bit different, but it's the same thing, essentially. It's complementary. So you get an idea of exactly what I stand for, where I'm going, what I think. And I think the best thing at this point is to let you go at me, because what I've done is given you an outline, and you may have some pungent questions to throw in which fill the gaps. Okay, so Debbie, take over.
Thank you, Lynn. I'd like to begin by putting to Lynn a couple of questions that were submitted via the internet, because I think that they are significant. And I will generally identify the individuals who asked the question. One question that has been submitted has come from it's come from a gentleman in New York who actually currently is on the staff of someone who served in a previous Democratic administration and who currently serves on the board of a major U.S. bank. And I know that this is a product of some discussion that they have had, and they want Mr. LaRouche's comments on it. Their question, Lynn, is the following. It's on he says, on the subject of what we've come to refer to here as a potential financial 911. There's very little doubt that the state of the international financial system, and in fact the state of international banking, is fragile. We are dealing with a system that is without question in a state of near collapse. However, even conceding that, the actions of this administration cannot be explained as policies due to near incompetence. Nobody is that incompetent. In fact, upon reflection of how indeed the policy toward the dollar is being conducted, as well as other related policies, including the setting of interest rates, it would seem that there is a conscious drive to exact maximum chaos and provoke the equivalent of a national state of emergency in the midst of financial collapse. This certainly would serve to abrogate any commitment to constitutional rule in the United States. This is something that is very hard to conceptualize. We don't see anything like that in the history of our nation, but it's very hard to ignore it as a possibility in the current circumstance. Would you please comment?
And this is one of those $64 billion or $64 trillion questions, which I shall answer. I think it's extremely appropriate. I've referred to it already. The point is this. Those who are, and I've been discussing this with leading bankers in Europe and some in the United States recently, who've asked me this same question. And I've given a qualified answer today. I shall give the same answer that I gave them, but I shall add some names. First of all, the way in which Alan Greenspan and the bankers associated with him are operating makes no sense to people who are knowledgeable, unless you can prove they're absolutely insane, that is, their brains don't function anymore, or unless they have some criminal intent, which may not be quite so obvious. Those of us who have discussed this, and this includes international financial circles as well as those in the United States, agree with me that these fellows know exactly what they're doing, and their intent is criminal, beyond the belief of most citizens and politicians in the United States. Now, who are these people? Well, without going to who I suspect which little interesting group I know is involved in this, I would simply say it's a banking group, a private financial banking group, which was involved in France in setting up of the Banque Worms operation, which gave us the Vichy government and was in bed with Hitler and those who were plotting the Nazi takeover of Europe during the 1940s. The same group. Exactly the same group. All right. Who is behind it? Well, again, you're neoconservatives. Which neoconservatives? Did you ever hear of Mondale? Did you ever hear of the Siena Bank, which is having a meeting right now? Do you ever hear of Robert Bartley of the New York Times, of Wall Street Journal, who's a stooge for these guys, one of Mondale's stooges, has been since 1971 at least, long-standing enemy of mine. These are the guys to look at. What I refer to is what might be called a wingding. You drop the interest rate, what they're referring to. You drop the discount rate, the way Greenspan is doing it now. You thus pump up hyperinflation, which we're in right now. Don't believe anyone who tells you differently. That's the problem. You've got, for example, the mortgage-backed security bubble, the credit insurance bubble, and so forth and so on, as well as the usual Wall Street bubbles, various kinds of bubbles. These are all being pumped up as hyperinflationary bubbles. The way they're being sustained is by dropping the discount rate, Japan-style, toward a zero overnight lending rate, which is used to use Japan as a way of propping up the U.S. dollar in markets for a long period of time. Now, this means you're coming to an end game, where at this point we're close to the barrier at which there's a general blowout of the financial system. That's the day that your bank actually closes, that your firm goes shut, that the state government no longer pays the salaries, the city government no longer pays. A breakdown. How does that happen? The breakdown starts. Alan Greenspan sends the discount rate up, and all the suckers are wiped out. So everybody who is buying into the financial markets now, being suckered by the promises of a recovery or a bounce back, is being set up for the chop. Now, the precedent for this, 1931. The collapse of the Versailles banking system about 1931 resulted in a meeting of a group of financiers who set up the Bank for International Settlements, which is based in Basel, Switzerland, to the present day. This locked up international credit. To get credit, you had to go to the Basel Bank for International Settlements group to get credit. When Hitler was brought into power, when Schack was made the economics minister again, Schack started the Nazi rearmament because he was able to get cooperation from the Bank for International Settlements to finance Germany for its arms buildup. Whereas Germany was previously collapsed from 1931 on by being shut off from credit by the BIS group. So this is one of those tricks. And look at Mondale, among others, and the group associated with it, which is an integral part of the neocon group. And you can look at various other officials who could be agents of this type of thing inside government. But this is not a possibility. This is presently ongoing. This is a conspiracy against the United States, against the world, but especially the United States. And what the question reflects, those in high places inside the United States who know the game, who say, tell us it ain't so, to me. I'm saying, you're right, it is so. I know exactly how it's being done. So therefore, by saying it today in the way I say it, I may get shot for this, but nonetheless, the message is out. There is a game. And tell Robert Mondale and his friends we don't want him to do it. And some others. They know who I'm referring to, who I didn't name.
What I'm going to do, since we have several questions actually continuing on this topic, let me first ask, Senator Jones, do you want me to ask your question, or do you want to come and ask it yourself? Okay. Lynn, this is along the same lines. Senator Jones has submitted 2 questions, and you might want to kind of deal with them. Well, I'll let you deal with them as you choose to deal with them. I always try to give him this advice, but he ignores me anyway. So, the first question is, Mr. LaRouche, you stated that the IMF and most of the American and European banking institutions are bankrupt due to failing policies. What specifically are those policies, and how shall we change them? The second question is, you indicated that actions by Alan Greenspan and others could be construed as either criminal or incompetent. Assuming that they do know what they're doing, what do you believe is their motive? What do you believe is the motivation behind these actions, and what ultimately is their goal? Obviously, you addressed some of that in the answer you just gave, but.
Well, the game is very simple. It's a big game. What the problem with people have with this kind of question, and I think our question from New York had no problem understanding it, is that money is not real. That's the key. Money is paper. Did you ever talk to a dollar bill? What kind of a conversation did you have? Money is what? At best, money is, under our laws, which is no longer obeyed, money is currency issued by the federal government with the consent of Congress, by the executive branch with the consent of Congress, by the treasurer, officially, but under the president. Then what is it? Why do we circulate money? What's its value? The value is the ability of the federal government to control its value by management. One of the main functions of the Treasury Department of the U.S. government is to manage the currency, to manage its circulation, to manage it through taxation, to manage it through interest rates, through preferential interest rates, to manage it through legislation which is enacted by the Congress, and so forth and so on. And to get the money flowing in such a way, to do what? Take what has happened, say, since 1966 in the U.S. economy, as opposed to what should have happened. You have 3 curves which tell you what the monetary system of the U.S. economy is. One is the so-called growth of financial assets. Second, you have the rate of monetary emission. Third, you have the growth or shrinking of the physical assets per capita and per square kilometer. Net physical assets. Over this period, since 1966, you have not a uniform but a steady trend. Financial assets were running up, leading, until 1999. Monetary expansion was pumping the financial markets. But the physical value of U.S. output per capita of consumption and output was collapsing. Look at our families. Look at the lower 80% of family households. Income. They've been collapsing. The lower 80% of family income brackets in the United States have been collapsing. Look at the conditions of life. Look at latchkey children. Look at schools. Look at health care. Look at everything. Look at basic economic infrastructure. All of these things that affect the typical person in the lower 80% of family income brackets is collapsing, including employment, factories, everything, places of employment. So what's wrong? Is money is growing in nominal value, but the value actually received is collapsing. Now, one of the purposes of government in managing money is to make sure that the value of things in prices does not go in one direction contrary to the value of real goods, say income and so forth, standard of living, productivity, things. What has happened is we have gone into a post-industrial, consumerist-oriented society, which is predatory, which lives by sucking on the rest of the world, like a bloodsucker, like Dracula. We have used our power, our control over the IMF system, to dictate the relative values of currencies. We've dictated the conditions of life of the world, and we loot the world for their cheap labor and their products for the things we consume, and we don't even pay for what we import anymore, as our current account deficit shows. What should be the case is money should be regulated in such a way that the financial prices do not rise relative to physical values. In other words, an anti-inflationary policy. We do that in various ways. For example, we used to say we had the investment tax credit program under Kennedy. Right? The idea is if a citizen will invest, instead of taking the profit out of a firm and distributing it, as for stockholder shareholder values, will invest in improving the production of that firm by investing that capital back in the firm, better machine tools, so forth, or make a contribution to the community and donations to the community for community benefits, that person should get a benefit in the tax treatment by the government, by state, federal, local government on that basis. And that's the way we normally manage the currency, is by legislation, taxation, and so forth, with the purpose of saying we are going to have a strong dollar policy. A strong dollar policy means the content of the dollar will be such that the person who saves the dollar, by saving it, will find that the dollar is worth more in purchasing power next year than it was this past year. That is a sane dollar policy. So the problem here, in this case, what they've done is they've run the dollar up. Now, you know, when Bob Rubin and Bill Clinton were faced with the crisis in August, September of 1998, the so-called GKO crisis, the second major international crisis, Bill went to Wall Street and went to the Council of Foreign Relations and made a speech about market reform. And then something came out of the basement of the White House and threatened Bill with impeachment at about the time he talked about changing the monetary reform. At that point, with the October Washington conferences on monetary policy, the United States moved with other nations to what was called a wall of money policy, in which the drug pusher George Soros played a key part. George Soros is one of the advisors in this. They were looking at immediately a February 1999 threat of a Brazil crisis. So what they did to try to avert the Brazil crisis was flood Brazil with George Soros's money and George Soros's control over the treasury of Brazil. At that point, in the spring of 1999 through the spring of 2000, it became apparent to us that the amount of money being poured out to try to keep the dollar system from collapsing exceeded the amount of financial values being rolled over. In other words, a hyper-inflationary trend was already in place. It was obvious to us by spring of the year 2000 that the hyper-inflationary trend was systemic, not episodic. It was not a one-time shot, it was a systemic problem. So since that time, the U.S. has been bankrupt, which is how I made my forecast at the beginning, before Bush was actually inaugurated, of what would happen under Bush. I said the man is stupid, therefore he'll continue to follow these economic policies, therefore the economy is going to sink, and I'm afraid somebody's going to pull a Reichstag fire to try to get a dictatorship in this country, and that's what happened on September 11th, 2001. Right? That's been the trend. Now we're at the point where the whole system, a hyperinflationary system, is about ready to disintegrate. These guys are not thinking about money. They're thinking, if you can control the world, if you're the world dictator, you can determine who has money and what the value of it is. It's an old game. This is the same game that was played in Europe in the 14th century, which led to the collapse of the Lombard banking system and led to the so-called New Dark Age of the 14th century. This kind of policy. This is what is in game now. These fellows are out to play a Hitler-like policy in economics and finance the way they are in military policy and nuclear weapons against the world. You just have to understand their wormy little minds. And as I know them, these guys, this is exactly the way they think, and that's exactly the way they do it. The point is, what the citizen says often, well, how do we deal with it? It's very simple. Eliminate their power. If you're not ready to act to eliminate the power if somebody's about to destroy civilization, don't say, what's the solution? Eliminate their power. That's the power of representative government. Make it work. Use the power of government, mobilize to get government to use its legitimate authority to put these guys out of this business. Otherwise, you're going to get the worst.
Let me just say we have some more questions on the question of economic policy, both in terms of international finance and also in terms of domestic policy. I will come back to those in a moment. What I do want to do is entertain a question that has come in specifically on what Mr. LaRouche has said regarding the existence of a Trojan horse inside the Democratic Party. The first question comes from someone who is a well-known political consultant in the United States and who resides here in Washington. And Lynn, after I ask you his question, I have a few questions related to it from some of the elected officials who are here today. But what he says is you've called the Democratic Leadership Council a Trojan horse designed to guarantee the re-election of George W. Bush. I have to tell you I disagree with you. He says it's in the immediate interest of the DLC and very particularly in their financial interest to elect someone who is nominally a Democrat whose policy they would control. It's my view that, in fact, it would be far more difficult to organize any kind of opposition to a Democratic president who was controlled by the DLC. I'd like your thoughts on this.
Well, first of all, I disagree. Let's talk about where did the DLC come from? Well, down there someplace, but what's its content? Go back to 1966, Biloxi, Mississippi. That's where it began. When Richard Nixon, running for president, met with the leadership of the Ku Klux Klan and with Trent Lott. And that's where it started. This was the so-called Southern strategy. And you had all these racist Democrats were joining the Republican Party at various stages, along with the so-called boll weevils, came out of the cotton. All right, now, in response to that, you had a shift which occurred around a fellow called Scoop Jackson and Moynihan, these two creeps. Remember, Moynihan went into the... Scoop Jackson was a war hawk. He was out for war. He was against people generally. It's called a social democrat. But then you had Moynihan, who was a property of Averell Harriman. And Moynihan went into the Nixon administration out of Harvard. He was the guy that really invented the bell curve. Some of you know what the bell curve is? All right. So he worked on social policy. He was the guy involved in the area of setting up the replacement of Hill-Burton as a health program by HMOs, which took away the D.C. General Hospital, among other things. All right. So what happened is you had a right-wing evolution centered about people who had been formerly Trotskyists, especially the Social Democrats of America, that type. Some of them had been Zionist or whatnot. And they became more and more right-wing all along. And this was the emergence of a process which led into a 1976 meeting in Kyoto of the Trilateral Commission under the auspices of the Trilateral Commission leader, Zbigniew Brzezinski. This featured a Samuel Huntington paper on crisis in democracy. Brzezinski used this in his administration of Carter to put through what became known as the Project Democracy, which was a fascist right-wing program. Averell Harriman's wife, Pam Harriman, put through a step in this thing. So you had under Reagan the establishment of Project Democracy. Now both political parties from the top are controlled as party machines by Project Democracy through the Congress. So at that point, the right wing, which had been coming into taking a takeover of the Democratic Party through Brzezinski and company, the Trilateral Commission operation of 1975, 76, and 77, now took control. And both parties were controlled from the top in terms of party machine, that is the party machine, as opposed from the elected officials of the local state, were controlled from the top by these guys. And that's the Trojan horse. You see today, look, take the policies. Take the policies of Donna Brazile. Look what happened. How did George Bush get non-elected? Donna Brazile was the manager. She's part of this right-wing crowd. Was the manager of the campaign for Gore and for Lieberman. What happened? Now, if they had gone into Arkansas and had campaigned in Arkansas, they would have come out of there with the Electoral College vote, and the election would have been over. But instead, she and her crowd went down to Florida and began stroking Joe Lieberman's right-wing Cubans. And the election got jammed up. Now, I don't think Al Gore was any good, and Lieberman was worse. But the point is, that's the way the politics worked. There is no honest politics in the Democratic Party from the top down now. Don't kid yourself. It doesn't exist. The only way you'll get honest leadership in the Democratic Party leadership is to put it there. And it has to come from... There are no smart deals that you can make with the present Democratic leadership around the DLC. They belong to the right wing. They are the same inhuman species as the neocons. They are neocons. They think like neocons. They're thugs. They're not even human most of the time. And the thing you have to do is replace them. And the way to replace them, you raise one issue: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The problem with some Democrats is they think there's a smart way to play the game. And this is my Hamlet problem I talked about. Hamlet says, this is what makes cowards of us all. Because they're not willing to risk their neck. They're too much like draft dodgers. They're not willing to risk their neck by deciding one way or the other what they stand for. They're trying to maneuver and handle the situation. And therefore they say, what's the smart way, the no-risk way to deal with the problem? And often in history, as in war, the real solutions are only risky ones. there are no risk solutions. And I think the objection to my criticism of the Democratic leadership from many people in the Democratic Party is they're looking for a no-risk solution. And they say of me, well, you take risks. Sure, I took risks. I've taken many risks. My own government tried to kill me 3 times, at least to what I know, officially. Yes, I've taken a risk. The Soviet government wanted to kill me. Gorbachev wanted to kill me. His wife wanted to kill me. Officially, you should have seen what happened in 1986. Sure, I've taken risk. I'm still alive. But I took the risk. The problem with the baby boomer generation among leaders is they tend not to be risk takers. They tend to be war resistors. They don't go to military service. Oh, that's for dummies. Look, there must be a better way to handle this situation. Now, war is sometimes the wrong thing to do. Often is. But if you're not willing to take the risk, you're not qualified to be a leader. And that's what our problem is. We have leaders who are often good people, people I regard as useful, intelligent, and so forth. But when it comes to taking a risk for a principle, they fail. They say we might lose. Yes, you might lose. But if you don't take the risk, you won't win. And that's the problem.